last week we talked about user studies and study design and like the basic variables that we need to like think about and like basically try to establish a ground, like a level of like understanding of how to design a good user study. I think that in general can be of value for you in the future, and in that sense actually for machine learning as well, because I think there's also like a little bit of a lacking culture in machine learning experiments, and sometimes did I talk about this? Did I talk about like where you can have, yeah, I think I did. So where you can actually have the worst algorithm beat the other algorithm by just like running the iterations more than once. So I think computer scientists and machine learning experiments, you can learn a lot from just social sciences and how they design studies and evaluate actual outcomes. So we talked about all these kind of things. I think important here are the typical variables that social scientists use a lot. So independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variable is the one that is manipulated and the one that you use to split up your groups, and the dependent variable is the one that you're actually measuring. So that could be, the independent variable could be type of classifier, type of feature set, and the dependent variable would be performance on these different groups in machine learning experiments. I think this is also important to know just in general if you ever come across studies that other people have designed, they might use this language, and I think it becomes more and more interesting for computer scientists to also get involved in these interdisciplinary research areas. And so for me personally, I work a lot with psychologists and psychiatrists, and where we often like have human behavioral data, and they would design their studies in very precise ways, and like they use a lot of these vocabulary so that you can basically understand what their study design is, what their hypotheses are, and so that then we can add on top of them and can kind of like enable them to do more interesting research through engineering, through computer science and machine learning. I think there is actually quite a bit of a movement these days. It's kind of like called engineering plus X, where the X could be anything really, like healthcare, social science, biology, chemistry, etc. And like I think a lot of future jobs will be in this area. And I think USC is kind of like quite at the forefront of this movement as well. And we talked about how to like finally or like precisely come up with hypothesis statements, and in that sense, like we also should kind of follow this kind of sequence where you should not formulate your hypothesis after you have received or like collected your data, but you should have this hypothesis beforehand, identify your variables that you want to measure and manipulate, and then you want to also then make sure that your experimental design follows those rules, and then that your data in the end actually can be interpreted in that way as well. Okay, talked about a couple of within subject and between subject issues and like thought processes that need to go in there. Talked about reliability and validity. So it's kind of like, I hope that it's not too much or too complex, but there are just a lot of these considerations that you should keep in mind and when designing studies. We talked about this fun like example study with the desert ants, and some of them walking on stilts, some of them walking on stumps. And I think this is a nice illustration of like what the hypothesis was, how to manipulate that, how to measure it, and basically then also how to evaluate it. And I would like to emphasize here that I like the visualization that they used here, but I feel like it could be augmented as well. So what would be one way to kind of augment this visualization here?
I like histograms. So I would like to know how many of them made it here, how many of them made it there.
Okay, but this, like these box plots kind of give you this information, right? So you have like your median, so 50% made it here,
Right.
Yeah.
and then you have 75% made it in between here, and then you have like probably. So that's now like these whiskers are more related to like magnitudes of standard deviation. So you kind of have information. So also like there's this kind of measure that you could use, like data points per inch or something like that. Like so that these are pretty compact representations of distributions, and possibly more compact than histograms. Well, another thing that I would like want to see, I think, in this plot is basically what. So, for example, if there is like a significant difference between this and that, or just that, and like you can see that this like kind of gets close to it. So I'm not sure if there's actually a significant difference, or if the significant difference is only between those two groups. So is it, so you can add like these type of brackets. So one of the things that I often do is I connect like these plots through a bracket here and add stars here, so that you can directly see, okay, that's a significant difference, or this is not a significant difference. And we talked about the statistical tests after this as well. So that would be one way I would feel like that there could be an augmentation in this visualization as well. Okay, so that would be one way. Can you think of other ways? That's just a trick question. I don't know any other ways. Okay, cool. Yeah, and then so the reporting about data of data. I kind of like this. So the mean distance, the interquartile range. You could change this into like the mean distance and the standard deviations. I like to add the number of observations that go into this, and this can also be reported within like your statistical test, like where you state the number of degrees of freedom, for example. So it's just kind of like these rules of housekeeping, or like how to properly report your results, so that others can actually make assumptions and can learn from the data. If you're very like if you're very shady about like trying to hide your experimental design and the outcomes, like you sometimes get to publish, but really like it doesn't really help others. You don't really understand what's happening. You don't get to like learn from the others, research questions, research problems, and even though I know that there's like a big problem with like publishing negative results. However, within our group, I'd rather know that you did the due diligence on like evaluating and reporting results, rather than just reporting good ones. And there's no like negative impact if the approach doesn't work out. So that's something to keep in mind. And I really don't. So I think there's like it's a kind of like a cultural problem sometimes when students get pushed, and like in particular PhD students, if they get pushed too much, like you have to publish, you have to publish, you have to publish, there might sometimes be like an inclination to like fiddle with the results, which is very dangerous, and say like nobody ever should do that. So I'd rather have no publication than one that is lying. So that's just so rather like you know, report negative results if you have some, then play with the results. Okay. Yeah, we talked a little bit about this, but it's really kind of should be kind of clear. Here again, I guess it would be nice to have these kind of brackets, which we have visualized in this one. Then these histograms, as Natasha said, are kind of interesting. I mean, you kind of see directly if the distribution is normally distributed, if it's really not normally distributed. But what you don't really see, like you can't really quantify. I mean, you don't really have the ability to count, like, okay, how much is this part of the outliers, like how many data points are there. And sometimes you actually don't really need to know this in any case. So you get to see the median, or like the kind of like the mode of this distribution, but not much more. So I prefer these more compact representations like bar plots and box plots. Another thing that's missing in the bar plots, for example, is that here you only have like the mean or the median value in these. So you could add like these kind of whiskers here. You could add whiskers of like standard deviations around the median or mean value. But you could also add the so-called standard error, which you can get like from MATLAB or from R or whatever program you're using. You could put that here, and then you can already, like if this standard error is here, for this distribution is like this, and for this it's like there, and these two don't touch, so the upper and the lower of the other one don't touch, then you know it's significant. So that's already kind of like a good indication to add to these kind of plots. So like just if you visualize something, think about like what you want to visualize, and like how to make it more apparent to the reader, like what's going on. These scatter plots can be helpful to show like relationships between variables. In this case, like when you see that there's like a linear relationship, you could add a diagonal that basically is the regression. We know how to calculate the regression of these two random variables. And we can also add like a Spearman correlation or Pearson correlation coefficients to this to basically identify or indicate the linear dependencies between the two random variables. So in this case it's PTSD and depression, which indicates that there's a high comorbidity between the two conditions. That's just something that we found in our data. Basically we tried to classify depression separately from PTSD, and then I'm like, okay, let's look at like how much they're related to each other, and they seem to be like one-to-one relationship almost. So that's kind of interesting. Another way, yeah, so the box plots, I kind of like them. This is a nice visualization of them, I guess, where you can see that kind of like these, what the box sort of means. You can redefine these. I think this is not necessarily like how the standard, like there's no fixed standard, but if you change from like this more or less accepted representation that you have the median here, but you want to use the mean for whatever reason, or you want to use quartile 1, quartile 2, or like a quartile 1 and quartile 3, and you want to change that to something else, you would just add that in the image description, like the caption of the figure, and you can really define that in other, like in R, for example, you can define what you want to have there. just make sure that you describe what's in the data. And then if you have data points that are outside of these whiskers, sometimes you can have like little stars or little dots that show that there are outliers. Okay. That should be kind of more or less clear. Yes? Okay. Then we talked about statistical evaluation, and I think this is kind of like the most important part of this lecture that we had last week. And we want to kind of compare two distributions, and just because the mean values of the outcomes are different doesn't mean that there is a significant difference between the two. And that's very important for like machine learning and classification problems, where in most of the cases, I see that very often in deep learning, that people just report one mean value and not like a mean value plus a standard deviation and the statistical test between multiple like baselines and the current investigated like new approach. The problem here really is that that we don't necessarily know if the result is a result of a couple of things, right? Like it could be the initialization of your variables, that you might be lucky in your new algorithm and unlucky in the baseline. You can also try to be more unlucky in the baseline and rerun it until you have the worst result that you've ever seen in the baseline. That's also not very good practice, as you can imagine. So don't do that. But so the initialization variable could be a problem. Then another one could be like, did you use the right learning rates for each of the approaches? So like if you validate 25 different values for your new approach, you should validate the same values for your baseline approach, or give it at least the same chance to be as good as your approach. And then you want to run it multiple times because you also don't know if the results are based off of like your training, test, and validation split. You cannot guarantee that for another data set split you would have the same results. So ideally you want to run your experiments 10, 20 times, report mean values, report standard deviations, remember all your values that you had, and then compare the two performances from the baseline model and the new model. Like I see this all the time, that really like major publications, like really good papers in machine learning just report one value, and that's a tiny bit better than the previous value. It doesn't really mean that they're better or worse than the other method. And so why do you think these really good people are doing that? Well, there are deadlines, right? And everybody. So if you have a system that you come up with and it's really complex and like it trains for weeks, right? You're not gonna run this experiment like 20, 30 times.
Yeah.
So that's a real big problem of deep learning, I think, and it's kind of something that I'm telling my students all the time is like if we publish or if we try to publish a new method in these machine learning conferences, yes, we report to get an improvement on like maybe a baseline or something, but that's not the main finding. We don't just want to show off like how good our approach is, but we want to also discuss like why we think it is, like what's the change, what is the idea behind it, the improvement, and what's the other added benefits that you get. So for example, we had one paper about incorporating emotional information to predict the next couple of words, and it seems to work quite well in improving the in improving like the next word or predicting the next word, and I can talk about this maybe next week or after we talked about LSTM models, I can highlight that study. But the additional cool thing that we found out is that you can, with this, also now generate sentences that have different characteristics. You can generate emotional sentences using this method. So you just try to be more creative and like try to discuss like what actually you hope to achieve with this kind of work, and it's not just always about the tiny improvement that you get. I've seen funny improvement, like 0.1% more. What does that mean? It's like it's funny, and there are like 15 methods reported that are all within like 0.3% error rate.
It might be even worse.
And it's not like it's like between 99.7 and 99.9. It's like between, what was it, like 16.3 and 16.6. It's like, okay, fine. Yeah, that's just probably as good as it gets on this data set, and sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not lucky. And so in statistical testing, what we want to know is basically how likely or how unlikely it is that the distributions of two kind of like sets of observations are the same or different. And even though the distance between the mean values is the same in this case and that case, these are much more different from each other than these, because there is less overlap up here than here. And you would say that these are significantly different while these two are not significantly different, because if you sample randomly from one or the other distribution, you often probably end up somewhere in the middle, or I mean probably like 20% of the time, while here you would hopefully only end up in this overlap like 0.5 or 5% of the time. And we discussed that there are different kinds of tests, parametric ones and non-parametric ones. Parametric ones I think you can use most of the time in your studies. It's like kind of sad that nobody really cares about the fact that you need to know that your distributions, the underlying distributions, need to be normally distributed. But often people just use it without like actually testing that that's the case. But if you have natural data, you most of the time kind of can assume that. But if you're not sure, use these other tests that are like non-parametric, that don't require you to have a certain underlying distribution, where you just basically look at basically the ranks if you order a list of your observations, and you just count like how many times it was one before the other and stuff like that. So that's more kind of like safer, but often people just use these parametric tests. And you can test for normal distribution in your of your data. There are like normality tests which you can conduct if you want to. But I think for the course project here should be fine without. We had a couple examples. The important part here is basically what your assumptions are, and so in t-tests you basically have two hypotheses. Hypothesis 0 is the null hypothesis that you want to test against. And the null hypothesis basically says that both samples have the same mean value, okay? And the hypothesis 1 says the samples have different mean values. They don't tell you anything else. That's important to note, right? They don't tell you necessarily like one algorithm is better than the other, or the distribution is different from the other. It just tells you that the mean values are different from each other. Okay, so that's the only thing that they tell you. So that's kind of like important. Yeah, so a couple of examples. If you have multiple groups, you can do an ANOVA test, which in this case tells you that one or more of the groups that you have in your ANOVA have different variances. That's all it tells you, right? Like or it has different, it is sampled from a different population. It doesn't tell you like which groups are different. So you have to do post hoc tests to see which groups are actually different from each other. Yeah. And we had like there are examples that you can run in all these programs that we have access to or should have access to. This was kind of like a fun joke. Then we talked about, are there questions to that? So I think it should be clear to everybody that if you want to do that in your quest project, you just like conduct an ANOVA and then maybe do some follow-up t-tests and see is one classifier outperform the other, and then you can discuss like why. And like the one example that I gave, it's kind of like you want to classify, I don't know, a sequence, and you use support vector machines that only get like access to like one observation for each sequence, while a sequence classifier will get like the entire sequence, so they can learn the dynamics of the sequence and so on. So like discuss the differences if you observe significant differences between the two classifiers. And you can stick to the standard ones like t-tests and ANOVAs and stuff. Cool. So in a lot of like natural experiments where we have data from various sources like human behavior, maybe Twitter messages, opinions on Amazon for products, and this, like oftentimes when you involve kind of like human behavior, you have also the same thing happens if there are like cases that are not as clear. So for example, like tissue samples, is that a cancer cell or is it not a cancer cell? Sometimes that is not necessarily like a 100% clear thing for experts. Sometimes the expert might be tired when annotating, another expert might have a different opinion and so on. So there are often these issues where while it is still costly to get annotations and expert opinions on your data, to label large amounts of data, you often end up with like annotations that are not necessarily like conform across annotators. So people have different opinions, experts have different opinions on certain things. So the sentiment in Twitter messages, for example, like if you want to know is this Twitter message positive or negative in sentiment, like is there a lot of positive words in there or a lot of negative words in there, it's not clear. Like some people might think it is very positive, some people might think it's slightly positive or something like that, you know. And so these kind of opinions could be difficult to deal with if you want to like learn a classifier. They might, however, also give you additional information, like that might be something more informative, there might be something in there that you would like to actually like learn from. So you want to use the confusions to learn from these. But in our cases, often we want to know the inter-rater agreement or reliability to just weed out our data and say like, okay, we want to use those data points where they agree upon, and we want to remove those data points that we don't agree upon. And then if you just train your experts, you want to make sure that they agree on a subset of your like annotations, so that you make sure that your data at the end will have a high quality. So that these are kind of like the use cases. So like remove confusing data points that experts had trouble with. So you probably don't have, like your algorithm might have trouble with that too. And then the other one is like when you are creating a data set, you want to make sure that the raters agree on the annotations. So like the expert training, so to say. And there are multiple ways to do this, and like we have two different kinds of cases where in the one case we have like already segmented data. You give them one tweet at a time. So this is a tweet, this is a tweet, this is a tweet. These are the same tweets, obviously. And so they agree here, here, but they disagree on these two. And you would like to know, like, between those two coders, like, how much agreement is there. And if the agreement is below a threshold, you don't believe that they are actually in sync with what they think. So you want to maybe train them more, or maybe want to remove them from your data set. So that's it with segmented data. In continuous data, when you have like time series, one annotator might have a different onset or offset between the other annotator, and like you can use the same ways to calculate inter-rater agreement, but you have to kind of discretize at some point your annotation. So you would basically split each sequence into like subsets or subsegments. And so we then started off to like discuss a couple of ways to compute inter-rater reliability or agreement. The one that we started off with is the Cohen's kappa, and in this case we had two examples for if in a picture there's an eye blink or no eye blink, two coders that give us their opinions, coder 1 in the top line, coder 2 in the other line, and you can treat those coders basically as different classifiers. You can add, if you want to, you can add your classifier here and check like how much your classifier agrees with other coders. So that's another way to evaluate your method. Is my agreement between the human coders and the classifier high enough to say that they are looking at the same stuff? Okay, that's another kind of cool approach. So, but you can use those two outputs or two coder assessments as your predictions, and basically produce a confusion matrix where like you can now see that most of the time when there is what is read no eye blink, they kind of agree. When there is an eye blink, they like don't really agree too much. So like this corner here should have more support. And now you want to use this kind of as an agreement, like, so how much do these people agree? So one way to do this is to count the number of times when they're the same. So this is kind of 70% of the time. But that doesn't give you like an assessment of but basically, if they just say anything, what would be the chance that they're agreeing, right? So this is, we have two classes, and if they say, like, if you basically have 50% of the time each one of them says one or the other, right? And you just have a random possibility of agreement between the two. So what you want to do, you want to factor in the prevalence of each coder to say one or the other class, and basically subtract that from your agreement. That's kind of like what Cohen's kappa does. So you kind of take this observed agreement, but then you subtract from this calculation both the numerator and denominator the chance agreement, and the chance agreement basically can be calculated as such, where basically, so this is a little bit of a different example, but you can basically compute the chance of saying red plus the chance of saying blue for each of the raters separately. So that's kind of like their prevalences of saying something or the other, and then you use this 0.5 as their prevalence to say one or the other, and then you basically can compute first the agreement. You put it into your formula here, you calculate the per chance agreement, which is 0.5, and then now you find out, whoa, they don't really agree that much, because the kappa is valued between 0 and 1, and if it's close to 0, there's literally no agreement. If it's 1, there is complete agreement, and you want to basically for Cohen's kappa, I think you kind of want to be between like 0.6 and 0.8 to make sure that those agreements are kind of meaningful between your coders. Often you don't really have that value. If you do like human behavior, you sometimes have like pretty low agreement. That's just a problem of like subjectivity, and sometimes the quality of raters is sometimes pretty low if you use these crowdsourcing platforms. Okay. However, there are some cons of this. So it only works for 2 coders, and we have problems with like data points where no annotations are present. So maybe some person has just like skipped a few, and so that doesn't really account for that. And for this, we can use Krippendorff's alpha, where we have it's more generalizable. It's for interval scale data, for ordinal scale data, and for nominal data. So we can use it for all of those. We can use it for like 2 raters, 15 raters, 20 raters, doesn't really matter. And a lot of people use this for linguistic analysis and like agreement and human behavior assessment. The way basically Krippendorff's alpha is computed is basically the following. So it's like D0 or DO is the observed disagreement or disagreement in units. And we'll see how that looks like. And DE is the disagreement expected by chance or in total. And again, 1 is perfect agreement, 0 is no agreement at all. And so so the alpha is like kind of like 1 minus this ratio. And you can interpret it as the mean item distance divided by the mean total distance. And to visualize this better, I brought this, where in this case you have 5 coders. Each of these coders are basically one of these columns. There are some items like the A item where everybody agrees that it's a 7, some items here where everybody mostly agrees. This is not really the same value, but the variance is not that large. But then you have items where the variance can be quite large, or even like 2.3 and so on. So you basically use these single item variances and also use the total variance. So what you do basically is you compute the variance between all of those observations and also take the mean of these single items here. So like you take this thing here, compute the variance, and then you compute the variance over these as well. And that's the 2 values that you have. And then you divide them with each other and get the ratio and find out that this agreement here that we observe between those 5 coders is actually pretty cool and pretty good. There are softwares out there for SPSS and MATLAB and R, and if you can't find it, just shoot me an email. I have the function for MATLAB. It's called the Cree Alpha, I think, and it's pretty straightforward to use for ordinal, nominal, and interval scale data. You just have to define before you compute it what your data looks like. We usually use ordinal scale data. Okay. And values above 0.6 are pretty good and moderate. All right. So a little bit of a slow start today. Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about some ethical considerations. I've been asked that a couple of times, like, what is an IRB? And so in general, if you conduct a user study or some experiment at USC, you have to go through USC's internal review board. So you basically submit your study, you state the type of experiment you want to conduct, the type of user study that you want to do, who is involved. Is it protected individuals like prisoners, soldiers, students, underaged kids, etc. If you do that, you have to have specific or special IRB reviews, and most of the times when we test the system online, we would just put in like a basic IRB request. Most of the time it's like a follow-up or a mod to like an existing IRB that we have. We submit like a couple of sentences of what we're going to do, how much we're going to pay Mechanical Turk individuals, how much work it will be for them, what that equates to like as a basically like an hourly pay, and so on. So you have to do a couple of those things, and the IRB often just expedites those user studies if you just want to make annotations. If you actually want to record people in a lab setting, they go through full review, basically identify, well, if you talk to a virtual audience, try to improve your public speaking, you're at minimal risk of getting hurt by the virtual audience. So most of the time you just get like wave through and get minimal revisions to do. So this is kind of like a just it's in a sense that people often think of it as a nuisance, but in the end it actually protects you from lawsuits. That if something actually happens, well, USC's IRB had considered this to be safe, so you were off the hook, but maybe USC might not be. So that's like they kind of protect you for that. And a couple of responsibilities that you have. Obviously, protect the participants' confidentiality, do not harm the participants, inform them about what the study is about, and if you have like a hidden manipulation, you should disclose that after the study and tell them what actually happened. Yeah, that's kind of like in the debrief where you also give them the money, and just basically some typical steps to consider. If you do machine learning experiments with data that's out in the wild, like you download from Kaggle or something, you don't really need IRB because you're not testing humans, but you're testing a system against data. And usually, like if the data was collected from humans, they already have consent. If you do like download loads of data from YouTube and use people's faces, etc., in your analysis, I think it would be good to get an exemption from IRB, but then just be sure that you don't really show people's faces in like conferences and stuff like that. But you could, for example, try to get like access or like ask them, send them an email, say like, hey, is it okay if I show this video at a conference? And if not, then just mock up something new that maybe yourself acted out. Let's do a 10-minute break and then we talk about hidden Markov models. Or are there any questions to this?